I've always been really interested in smart people doing dumb things. And I've always been really fascinated by why is it that, humans are incredibly intelligent organisms, and yet we seem to struggle with what seems to be a very simple problem. Prioritize your larger later over smaller sooner rewards. Why can't we do this? And as it turns out, it's a much more complex problem than we imagine.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff. With departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others, the college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Joining me today in the ASC Marketing and Communication Studio is Ken Fujita, Professor of Psychology at the Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. His research draws from a number of areas in psychology, including motivation, cognition, self-regulation, and judgment and decision-making. Dr. Fujita, welcome to Voices.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I'd like to start first with a description of your lab, the Motivation and Cognitive Science Laboratory. Tell us about the work that you're doing here.
Broadly speaking, I'm really interested in how what people want and how they think impacts their decisions and their behavior. So by motivation, we're referring to the desire to have something or the desire to avoid something, and it can encompass any number of things, whether that be weight loss, better social relations, to feel good about myself. And we're also interested in how that interacts with the way that I think about things and how that influences our behavior. So for example, how I think might impact what I want, and what I want might impact how I think. And I'm really interested in that dynamic.
Give us an example of that dynamic. How does
Sure.
that work?
I'll give you an example from some of my classic work in self-control. So imagine that you're a dieter and you're presented with a piece of chocolate cake. You have this weight loss goal, but you also have this chocolate cake. How you think about the chocolate cake can impact how much you want it. So if you think about how the chocolate cake would be a really tasty treat, a wonderful little indulgence, chances are you're going to indulge in the chocolate cake. You're going to want the chocolate cake, and that want is going to lead you to indulge. By contrast, if you were to approach the chocolate cake and you were to think about it as some sinful indulgence, or something that was morally wrong, or something that would be a bad example for your kids, you're less likely to want that chocolate cake. In fact, you're going to want those other things that you're thinking about, and it becomes easier to forego the cake and pursue those other goals. So that's the kind of dynamic that I'm really interested in.
So I want to make certain that I'm not misunderstanding this. So motivation or self-control is not cognition?
They involve components of cognition, but they also involve components of motivation. And I think to really understand things like self-control and goal pursuit, we have to understand this complex system that you might think of as sort of the hot system, the things that I really want, that drives my desires, and how that interacts with how I think. You might think of that as sort of the software. Which software do I load in order to pursue and to further those motivations? Now, sometimes I gave you an example of how cognition can impact motivation, but motivations can also impact cognitions or how I think. So, for example, research has shown that kids who come from poor families, they will literally see coins on the table as larger than kids who are from richer families. And the argument here is that, or at least the interpretation of this finding, is that the motivation for money attunes my attention to those things and then thus makes them look bigger. So how I think about things, how I perceive them, can even be impacted by how much I want them.
Is this similar to the Marshmallow experiment?
Absolutely.
Maybe explain what that is.
Sure. So the Marshmallow studies are probably the most famous self-control studies ever conducted. They were conducted by Walter Mischel, who at the time was a psychologist at Stanford University. He would bring children in and sit them at a table and present them with a plate with a single marshmallow. And he would tell them, he was going to leave the room for a while. They could help themselves to the marshmallow if they wanted to. But if they could wait until he came back, he would give them 2. And then he would leave, and they would time how long the children could hold out before they started to eat the marshmallow. Now, the dirty little secret is every single child ate the marshmallow.
See, I didn't realize that.
Yes. So the key variable here is how long they could wait. Now, in other studies, they changed the treat from marshmallows to pretzels to cookies. And they also gave the children strategies with which to fight those urges to eat the reward that was in front of them. And when they gave the strategies, children tended to be better than if they didn't have the strategies. They also found that older children tended to be better than younger children because they were using the strategies more. And so they were probably learning the strategies from their parents or from others over the course of time. They probably also had enough development to have the brain areas to be able to think and use these strategies. And so those were some of the most foundational studies in the work that I do.
What were some of those strategies that they were giving to these kids?
So one of the simplest strategies was for the child to simply hide the treat. So to turn the plate over and cover the marshmallows or to close their eyes. Other children, for example, would think about how they were instructed to do so. They would think about how the marshmallows were puffy white clouds. And because that took away the desirable elements of the marshmallow, they were able to wait longer. If you watch videos of the kids trying to do this, you also see kids trying strategies that don't work. So, for example, some of the children tried what's known as substitution. So rather than eating the marshmallow, they would just instead try to enjoy it by smelling it or licking it without actually consuming it. And unfortunately for them, those strategies didn't work, and the children who did that tended to eat them faster.
So, as I said, I wasn't aware that in this study all the kids ate the marshmallows because there have been a lot of conclusions, like significant conclusions that have been drawn from this study. Do we have to rethink those conclusions? When I say conclusions, like success in later life, their ability to put off, for instance.
Yes, I don't think we have to do that because what we're really interested in is the gradient of abilities, right? The distribution. And there's a bell curve, and that's what we're trying to find. There have been some questions about how diagnostic this particular test is in predicting future outcomes. It's controversial. So the original research team suggested that it predicts amazing things like academic achievement, financial well-being, and even incarceration rates. Later analyses have questioned some of these. I'm personally of the opinion that some of these criticisms are a little bit unfair. The argument wasn't that it was the sole predictor, but that it simply predicted. Many other factors come into play. And it's also true that you have to set these experiments up in the right way. So, for example, if children don't trust you, they're not going to wait, right? So if they don't trust you that you'll get the 2, then they'll eat the 1 immediately. And that makes a lot of sense. That's totally rational. So one of the secrets to make this stuff work was that you have to build rapport with the children. And I think that's something that wasn't articulated very clearly in the original experiment. So you can't just have some random stranger plop marshmallows in front of a kid and tell them to wait. There has to be some kind of relationship, some trust, and some certainty from the child that waiting is worth it. And I think this is important if you think about your own self-control efforts, because you have to believe that waiting is worth it.
I'm interested to know the kinds of experiments you're doing in your lab around self-control. I don't know if you're doing the marshmallow experiment. What are some of the experiments you're doing?
We are not doing marshmallow experiments, and that's partly because we're not working with children. It's amazing to work with children, but it has its share of challenges. I tend to work with adults, and I'm going to put that in air quotes because out of convenience, many of our participants in our studies tend to be college students, although we have tried to branch out to try studies on other adults as well. One of the things that I'm really interested in is what are some of the things that allow adults to be able to have better self-control than not? Because the studies that come from Walter Michel's research suggest that by the time you're 5, you have a preliminary understanding of how to forego temptation, right? So why don't we all have great self-control? And so I'm really interested in that. I'm also really interested in people who are good at self-control or generally successful. Why do they have lapses, right? So there are very famous cases of people who have achieved amazing things, politicians, celebrities who have done amazing things, and then they engage in behaviors that just looks crazy. I would like to try to understand the questions of who, when, and why some succeed and others don't at self-control. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is some of the psychological supports for self-control. So what do we do that helps us, and why don't we do this all the time? So one of the things that helps people engage in self-control is to think about their whys. So we know if you think about your values and your goals, these can be very powerful motivators that allow us to prioritize these concerns over local rewards. Life, however, requires us to be immersed in the here and now. Think about, the last time you had to complete some kind of task. If you're thinking about your values and goals, you're not engaged in the task itself. My wife often yells at me for not being in the present, that my brain is someplace else and I'm an absent-minded professor, that I need to do more to be in the here and now. And being in the here and now is really important. But if you're a dieter and you're hungry and there's a piece of chocolate cake in front of you and you are in the here and now, chances are you're going to eat that chocolate cake. So in addition to having to be in the here and now, life requires us to also take that proverbial step back and to expand our mental horizons and think about things that may not necessarily be immediately salient in the moment. We refer to this as expansion, and balancing the needs for expansion and immersion or contraction is one of the challenges that I think people struggle with, right? So we know it's good to be immersed when you have to do things like proofread, you're writing for some publication, or, you have to pay attention when you're cooking so you don't cut yourself or don't burn yourself. But at other times, you have to take that step back and you have to think about the bigger picture. And doing the right thing at the right time, I think, is the real challenge. And again, self-control is enhanced when I can take that step back, but life often requires us to be immersed. Mm-hmm. And so that balance, I think, is what people really struggle with.
Mm-hmm. Why do people lapse? What explains that, or what has your research demonstrated?
Well, I think people lapse primarily because life requires us to be attuned to what's going on now, right? So our lives are very busy. We're constantly putting out fires. It's all about making sure I survive the day. And this doesn't allow us the time or the space, the mental space, to take that step back and see the big picture. And so I think some of my research suggests that what's key to self-control is breaking out of that tendency to be in the here and now and to take the time to take that step back. And when I say time, I don't necessarily mean that you're thinking a lot or you're engaging in some kind of special thinking, but it's just sort of taking that proverbial step back and changing your perspective on things. And we're really interested in how people do that.
So why are some people better at it than others? Or do we all have the capacity?
I think we all have the capacity. We may not be as good at figuring out when I should be doing this, right? So some of us get caught up in the moment and we're just so into things that we just simply forget to take that step back, even though we know we should have. So sometimes it's just a question of doing it at the right time. Other times, I think we have pressure from the outside world. We have deadlines, we have competing demands, and that also requires us to immerse ourselves in the here and now. And so we literally don't have the time or space to be able to take that step back. And third, we may not have the right strategies. So we might not understand how it is to take that step back. Something as simple as take a breath. It might not occur to us in the moment to be able to do that. And we might try some other strategy that might not work. I'm glad you asked about strategies because a lot of people may believe that the key to self-control is willpower, to grit my teeth and to gut things through. In my lab, we've made the argument that what's key to self-control is to be smarter, not harder, right? So willpower strategies suggest that if you just try harder, if you just work harder, put more effort into something, you'll be more successful. Instead, in my lab, we encourage people to try different tactics or strategies. So if one method doesn't work and it's requiring a lot of effort, why not try something else? Consider, for example, all the kids in Walter Mischel's Marshmallow experiments. For them, they didn't just try to grit their teeth. They engaged in all kinds of strategies like covering the temptation or closing their eyes or thinking about white puffy clouds. In the same way, a dieter presented with chocolate cake or someone who wants to exercise more but also wants to go home and sort of nap on the couch, they can think of a number of different strategies that they might use beyond simply gritting their teeth and using their willpower. So, for example, a dieter might not buy their favorite desserts. The exerciser might pre-commit with a friend and promise them they'll show up to the workout. These are all tactics that make it easier to pursue one's goal without having to engage willpower. And that's one of the major themes of my work.
So self-control or lack of self-control is situational. In other words, you couldn't say that's a person who lacks self-control generally, that really these are situational matters.
We like to think of it situationally. There's also evidence that there are individual differences. We like to think, at least in my lab, we like to think of these individual differences as reflecting differences in skill. We might think of some people as being more skillful. They have a broader toolbox of tools that they use to address self-control problems. They're better about bringing these tools out when they need to use them. And so these individuals might just be more skillful at using the tools that they have available to them. Others might have fewer tools, and they may not be as good at using the right tools at the right time. The former is more likely to be successful at self-control, the latter less. So we don't think of self-control as some innate ability, like some inner strength or some muscle that we have. Instead, we think of it as a skill that people practice. You can develop more skills and develop the use of more tools, just like any technician might be able to. And I think thinking about self-control that way is really healthy because it allows you to make efforts to improve and to grow as opposed to just saying, well, I was born with this amount of muscle. I guess I'm just not going to be that strong anymore, or I can't get any stronger.
So self-control is learned behavior.
That's the way that my lab likes to think about it. Others might disagree, but that's sort of the perspective that we take, partly because our long-term goal is to be able to create interventions to help people with their self-control. And so we want to be able to at least model self-control in a way that at least allows us to have that goal. If we think it's innate, the ability to change just appears a little bit more daunting.
So if it's learned behavior, how do I learn it? Do I take a class in school?
That's a great question. I have some colleagues at the University of Michigan who, in collaboration with the John Templeton Foundation, are actually trying to create a curriculum for high school students to improve their self-control. And by all accounts, preliminary results suggest that it is useful. I think we learn self-control in a number of different ways, but it needs more research. But one could imagine we learn self-control as kids when we're trying to learn new skills, right? So I try to imagine kids who are in sports or in dance, right? Learning a new skill requires incredible amounts of self-control. You have long-term goals. You have to believe that if you keep working hard, you'll achieve those goals. You have to be willing to deal with setbacks and the temptation to quit. You have the temptation of doing other things instead of this sport or this dancing or this art that you were doing. So I think one way we learn self-control is from our teachers, from our coaches, from our mentors. I also think we learn it from trial and error. I guess what is exciting to me is that the research that's coming out about tactics and the research that's coming out of my lab, that self-control is a skill, it suggests that we can continue to refine our skills, even as adults. And that suggests that maybe there are programs or educational opportunities that we can develop that we can use to help identify some of the challenges that people have, try to provide them with more tools, train them to use those tools at the right time, and hopefully improve their self-control.
You're not using marshmallows. We've already established this. You work with adults. I'm interested to know your methods. How do you study the behavior of adults in your lab?
We will use one of two methods. One way is correlational. Because we think of self-control as a skill, one of the things that we often will do is we'll basically give adults a short little quiz that says, what would you do in this situation? What would you do in this situation? And by looking at what they say they would do, we can determine or assess to what extent they seem to appreciate the quote-unquote rules or tools of self-control. And then we try to observe their behavior and see whether the presence or absence of that knowledge or that presence or absence of that skill predicts positive outcomes or decisions. Another way that we do this is that if we think a particular tactic or a particular way of thinking or a particular skill improves self-control, we will bring people into the lab. We will experimentally induce them to use one or the other. And then we will observe them making some kind of decision or choice to determine whether they were successful or not. And so we try to bounce back and forth between these two methods. We do these more artificial experiments to see what works. And then we go into the field, so to speak, and we run more correlational studies to see, do the people who use this skill or this tool actually have better outcomes? So by bouncing back and forth between these two methods, we can balance their pros and cons.
So when you say observe their behavior, that means in a lab setting.
We can do it in a lab setting, or we can ask them to report their success. Obviously, there might be some self-report bias, but generally speaking, we find that there's still some signal in their reports. So we can do one of two methods. Again, we can either ask for self-report, we can bring them into the lab, we can observe their behavior, or we can have some objective indicator like their weight or some other outcome, like their grades in school or something.
And when you say go out into the field, what does that mean for a psychologist?
Well, I will put that in quotes because I think I have colleagues who really do go out into the field. They will go study behavior in ecologically valid settings and do really amazing work that way. When I say go out into the field, basically what I'm saying is we'll ask our participants to complete surveys that sort of give us a sense of what they're doing in their everyday lives.
You mentioned interventions. Is this one of the results of your research to produce therapy or interventions for patients?
Absolutely, one of our goals would be to create programs. I'm not sure we would necessarily think of it as therapy, but instead training programs that help people learn the skills that are necessary for self-control. And as I said, if we think of self-control as a skill, we don't necessarily just need to target those who are doing poorly, but we can also target those who are doing really well and want to be even better. So I think one of the nice things about thinking about self-control as a skill is it allows you to think of it as a continuum. And depending on what your aims are, you might be someone who struggle and you just want to get to average, but you may also be high achieving and want to achieve even more so. You can imagine, for example, the highest achieving athletes might still want to improve their self-control even further just to gain that little edge. And we would hope to be able to create programs for all of them.
So self-control or the study of self-control isn't a new problem in psychology. What is it that you are bringing, you and your research, what is it that you are bringing to this problem that might be new or different or innovative?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is when I joined the field, much of the focus of self-control research was on how to improve willpower. So much of what people tried to improve was how to get people to be stronger, how to get people, quote unquote, grittier. And I think my contributions to the science have really been to push this idea that it is a skill, that it's a set of tools or set of tricks that people bring to bear. And I think in that way, we're hoping to be shifting the conversation in a way that I think is more useful or helpful in terms of helping people over the long term.
Why that problem? Why has self-control been the focus of your research? Of all the things you could study, why self-control?
That's such a great question. The scientist in me wants to say that self-control is key to many, many problems. And that would be the professional answer that I would give to you. That self-control is involved in lots of personal and societal problems, things like addiction, poor social relations, poor financial decision-making, lots of really important problems seem to have at their core self-control. But I'll be honest, there's also a little bit of sort of personal interest in this, which is that I've always been really interested in smart people doing dumb things. And I've always been really fascinated by why is it that, humans are incredibly intelligent organisms, and yet we seem to struggle with what seems to be a very simple problem. Prioritize your larger later over smaller sooner rewards. Why can't we do this? And as it turns out, it's a much more complex problem than we imagine. I will also say that I think humans are actually better at this than they think they are. We remember our failures, but we don't keep track of our successes. So, for example, I successfully got to work today without binging on opium. I ate breakfast. I woke up on time. I didn't sleep in. I didn't, overindulge at breakfast. I didn't, go crazy. I wasn't checking out attractive women on my way here, and I was faithful to my spouse. So I think we don't give ourselves enough credit for how much self-control we do have. And then when we mess up, and we all mess up, we really focus on those mess-ups. And so I think that's another one of the themes of my research is that people actually might be better at this than they give themselves credit for.
Oh, so maybe we're not as dumb as we might imagine.
Indeed. I'm also really interested in athletes and other people who achieve these amazing things that require so much effort over time. I mean, if you think about these, like when I watch the Olympics, for example, I just marvel at these accomplishments. Even those people who don't win gold medals, like just the ability to make it that far requires so much effort, so much sacrifice, so much sustained effort over time. Those people's self-control is incredible, and I would love to understand that more. Partly because I would like to be like them, but also to help others to become like them.
So why are you in psychology as opposed to, why aren't you a violinist or why aren't you a baseball player or something else? Why psychology?
That's a great question, and I don't have a very good answer for you other than to say, when I was a freshman in college, I was not taking psychology courses, and my roommate was. And I would listen to him talking about what he was learning, and it was fascinating to me. And so I quit what I was doing.
What were you doing?
I was taking pre-medical classes.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I wanted to be a doctor, a medical doctor.
Medical doctor.
And so I quit taking those classes, and I instead took Psych 101, and that was it. I was hooked. Psychology is sort of the way that I think about people. I'm really interested in what influences how they think, feel, and behave. Those are sort of like the fundamental things that I think about when I meet other people. And the fact that you can study it scientifically, to me, was just so amazing.
Was there any indication in your life that this was going to be an interest? Or was it literally just sort of that moment with your roommate?
It literally was in that moment. I had never been exposed to psychology before. They didn't offer those classes to me in high school. So it literally was, he was talking about it, and I was like, I didn't even know people studied things this way. I thought psychology was the study of people on couches talking about their dreams. And some of it is, but that's not the kind of psychology that I was interested in. And what he was talking about was, and it was love at first sight. And I feel very fortunate to have had that experience because I know some people struggle to find what they love. For me, it just fell in my lap.
So in your lab, does that include undergraduates?
Absolutely. Mentoring is something that's really important to me, fostering the next generation. I've been blessed to have amazing mentors. I was brought into a lab as an undergraduate, and that's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so for me to be able to extend that opportunity to others is a really, really important mission.
If I'm an undergraduate, how do I become a part of your lab? What sort of qualifications would you want to see?
The best way to get into a lab is to first take some psychology courses, show that you can achieve and capable, and you know what it's like to think like a psychologist, and then to be persistent. We get approached by many more students than we can offer opportunities to. So persistence and passion is a really important characteristic to get into our lab. And once you get into a lab, be as active and engaged as you possibly can. The more engaged you are, the more you'll learn and the more opportunities you'll get.
I suspect you have to be motivated as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you just said you're looking for undergraduates who can think like a psychologist. What does that mean? What does it mean to think like a psychologist?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. I think what that means is to think systematically in a scientific way. So you have to understand the scientific method, but you also have to be willing to entertain lots of alternative possibilities. So even though you might think about something in this way, you have to be able to entertain the idea that other people might think differently. And that's actually what makes psychology interesting. Why do they think differently than me? What makes us different? And to what consequence? And I think that's the beginning of what makes a psychologist a psychologist.
Tell us what's next for your research.
We're going to continue doing some of this work to try to understand what are the tools that people can use to enhance their self-control. But as we've been talking about in this conversation, I think a major area of research for me coming up next is to try to start exploring interventions. I'm also really interested in exploring self-control in places that people don't normally think of as self-control. So for example, I was talking about how people respond to feedback, and particularly setbacks and negative criticism. We think of that as a self-control problem. I'm not sure everybody does. And so we're trying to take things that we know from self-control to see whether we can change how people respond to those particular situations. We're also interested in things like cooperation and coordination. Again, we don't tend to think of these as self-control problems, but I actually think they are. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is expand the purview of what is and what is not self-control, with the hope that if we can gain insights from one area, we can apply it to another to try to improve questions and situations and issues in those new domains as well.
Ken Fujita, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.